is being shaped by a struggle between the global majority in favor of a fairer distribution of global benefits and civilized diversity, and between the few who wield neo-colonial methods of subjugation in order to maintain their domination, which is slipping through their hands. The collective West has a calling card, and it has long been to reject the principle of equality and their total inability to reach agreement. Being used to looking down at the rest of the world, Americans and Europeans make all sorts of promises, and they take on commitments inter alia, written ones and legally binding ones, and then they just don't fulfill them. As President Putin pointed out, the West is one that is truly an empire of lies. Russia, like many countries, knows about this firsthand. In 1945, when we, along with Washington and London, together were vanquishing the enemy on the front in the Second World War, our allies in the anti-Hitler coalition were already making plans for an unthinkable military operation. That's what it was called, against the Soviet Union. 4 years later, in 1949, the Americans drafted a drop-shot operation to make mass-scale nuclear strikes on the USSR. These ghastly, senseless ideas did remain on paper. The USSR created its own weaponized retaliation. It took the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world was on the brink of nuclear war, for the idea of deploying it, and the illusion of victory stopped being the basis of the military planning strategy of the US. At the end of this Cold War, the Soviet Union plays a decisive role in reuniting Germany and agreed upon parameters for the new security architecture in Europe. Furthermore, the Soviet and then the Russian leadership was given concrete political assurances regarding the non-expansion of the NATO military alliance to the east. The relevant records of these negotiations are both in our and Western archives, and they're in open access. But these assurances by Western leaders were just deception. They in no way intended to uphold them. Furthermore, they were never bothered by the fact that by expanding NATO towards Russia's borders, they violated official commitments that were made at the highest level in the OSCE, commitments not to strengthen their own security to the detriment of the security of others, and not to permit the military political domination in Europe of any country, group of countries, or organization. In 2021, our proposals to conclude treaties on mutual security guarantees in Europe were rudely rejected without any change to the status of Ukraine being outside the alliance. The West continued its ongoing militarization of Russophobic Kiev regime that was brought to power as a result of a bloody coup, and to use this to wage a hybrid war against our country. Something that has been unprecedented since the end of the Cold War was a recent number of joint exercises between the US and their European NATO allies, inter alia, to develop scenarios for the use of nuclear weapons in the Russian Federation. The stated aim of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, and once and for all, this became crystal clear, the fact that they are clearly hell-bent on their own impunity, and they're bereft of their basic desire for self-preservation. Headed up by Washington, NATO countries not only are expanding and modernizing their offensive capabilities, but also are shifting the arms into space and the information sphere. A new dangerous manifestation of the expansionism was extending the alliance's area of responsibility to the entire eastern side of the world, using the pernicious slogan of the indivisibility stability of security of the Eurasian and Indo-Asian Pacific region. To this aim, Washington is creating its subordinate military, political alliances like AUKUS, the Troika of the US, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, the Quartet, Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, and Wellington. We're pushing the participants of these structures to practical cooperation with NATO. This is bringing its infrastructure into the Pacific area. It is obvious that such efforts are targeted against Russia and China and on the collapse of the inclusive regional architecture of ASEAN. This runs the risk of creating new explosive hotbeds of geopolitical tension, in addition to that which is hotting up very significantly around Europe. One certainly has the impression that the US and the Western collective that is fully subordinate to it have decided to turn the Monroe Doctrine into a global one. These ideas are totally illusory, they're extreme, but the Pax Americana will not stop it. The global minority is doing all it can to put the brakes on the acceleration of the natural course of events. The Vilnius Declaration of NATO on strengthening partnership between Russia and China has been characterized as a threat to NATO. Speaking to his ambassadors abroad, President Macron said he was really concerned about the expansion of BRICS, deeming that this shows that it, quote, complicates the situation in the international sphere in order to it runs the risk of weakening the West, in particular Europe. A review of the world order is underway, as is of its principles, and is undermining the way that the West is working. This is the end of that quote. So here's a revelation. If anybody wants to meet without us, become closer without us, or without our consent, then that poses a threat. The pushing of NATO into the Asia-Pacific region is something good, but the expansion of BRICS is dangerous. However, this logic is inexorable. The main trend has become for the global majority to strengthen their national interests, their sovereignty, their traditions, their culture, and their way of life. They don't want to live under anybody's yoke anymore. They want to make friends between themselves, solely on an equal footing and for mutual benefit. And such organizations such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are on the rise, and they are defending their rightful role in forming objectively our multipolar architecture. Perhaps for the first time since 1945, when the UN was established, there is now a chance for genuine democratization of global affairs. This inspires optimism for all those who believe in the rule of law internationally and who want to see the revival of the UN as a central coordinating body for global politics, a body where decisions are made about how to reach decisions together, having a fair balance of interests. For Russia, it is clear that there's no other option. However, the US and its subordinate Western collective are continuing to fuel conflicts which artificially divide humanity into hostile blocs and hamper the achievement of overall aims. They're doing everything they can to prevent the formation of a genuine multipolar fair world order. They are trying to force the world to play according to their own self-centered rules. I would like to urge Western politicians and diplomats once again to carefully reread the UN Charter. The cornerstone of the world order established at the end of the Second World War is the democratic principle of the sovereign equality of states, large and small, irrespective of their form of government, of their domestic, political and socio-economic structures. However, the West still believes that it is superior to everybody else. In light of what was said, the pernicious statement by the EU head of diplomacy, Mr. Borrell, namely that Europe is a blossoming garden and the rest is a jungle. He's not bothered by the fact that in the garden there's rampant Islamophobia and other forms of intolerance to traditional values of all world religions, burnings of the Quran, discrimination of the Torah, persecutions of Orthodox clergy, and disdain disdain for the feelings of believers are very commonplace in Europe. A gross violation of the principle of sovereign equality is the use by the West of unilateral coercive measures. Countries which are victims of these illegal sanctions, and there are an increasing number of them, are well aware that restrictions harm first and foremost the most vulnerable strata of society. They provoke crises in the food and energy markets. We continue to insist on a swift and full cessation of the US's unprecedented, inhumane trade and economic financial blockade of Cuba, and for a lifting of the absurd decision to declare Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism. Washington must, without any preconditions, abandon its policy of economic suffocation of Venezuela. We call for the lifting of unilateral sanctions by the US and the EU against Syria that openly undermine its right to development. Any measures that circumvent the UN and that are coercive measures must be ended, as must the West's weaponized practice of manipulating the Security Council sanctioned policies to exert pressure on those they don't like, something which clearly demonstrates the West's self-centeredness, their attempts to Ukrainize the international agenda by pushing onto the back burner a number of unsettled, unresolved regional conflicts, or crises rather, that many have been in place for decades now. The need in the Middle East really depend on solving the protracted Palestinian-Israeli conflict based on the UN resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. The Palestinians, for more than 70 years now, have been awaiting their solemnly made promise to them of having their own state. However, the fact that the Americans are monopolizing the mediation process means that they're doing everything they can not to allow this. We call for a pooling of efforts of all responsible countries to create conditions to resume direct Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. We are pleased that the League of Arab States has got its second win. It's stepping up its role in the region. We welcome the return of Syria to the Arab family, and we welcome the start of the normalization process between Damascus and Ankara, which we are shoring up with our Iranian colleagues. All these positive signs are backed up by the Astana format, which foster the Syrian settlement. We do hope that with the assistance of the UN, the Libyans can prepare for general elections in their long-suffering country that for more than 10 years has not got back on its feet after the NATO aggression that destroyed their state and opened the floodgates for the spread of terrorism to the Sahel region and waves of millions of illegal migrants to Europe and other areas of the world. The analysts have said, as soon as Muammar Gaddafi abandoned his military nuclear program, he was destroyed. Thus, the West has created astonishing risk for the entire nuclear non-proliferation regime. We're concerned by Washington and its Asian allies whipping up hysteria on the Korean Peninsula, where the strategic capabilities of the US are building up. The Russia-Chinese initiative to deem humanitarian and political challenges as a priority have been rejected. There's been a tragic development of the situation in Sudan. It's nothing other than the impact of the failed Western experiment to export its liberal and democratic dogma to the country. We support the constructive initiatives to speed up regulation, or rather settlement, of the domestic Sudanese conflict by providing assistance to have direct dialogue between the warring parties. When we see the nervous relation of the West to recent events in Africa, in particular Niger and Gabon, one cannot fail to recall how Washington and Brussels responded to the bloody coup in Ukraine in February in 2014, a day after agreement was reached on settling, under EU guarantees, the issues. But unfortunately, the opposition just trampled on this. The US and its allies supported the coup, hailing it as a demonstration of democracy. We cannot fail to be concerned by the ongoing deteriorating situation in the Serbian province of Kosovo. NATO NATO supplying arms to the Kosovo and helping them to establish an army grossly violates the key resolution of the Security Council 1244. The whole world can see how in the Balkans the sad story of the Minsk agreements in Ukraine is being repeated. There, I recall, there was stipulation for a special status for the republics in Donbass. However, Kiev openly sabotaged this with the support of the West. Just now as well, the EU does not want to force its Kosovo protégés to implement the agreements that were made between Belgrade and Pristina in 2013 to set up a community of Serbian municipalities of Kosovo. This would have special rules regarding their language and their traditions. In both cases, the EU acted as a guarantor for these agreements. Apparently, they share the same fate. You just need to look at the sponsor and you see the result. Now Brussels is imposing its mediation services, so-called mediation services on Azerbaijan and Armenia, along with Washington, and this is... And in fact, Yerevan and Baku actually did settle the situation. So the time has come for mutual trust building. There are Russian troops who will certainly help this. Now, talking about decisions of the international community that remain on paper, we call for a completion once and for all of the process of decolonization. This is in line with GA resolutions, and we want an end to all colonial and neo-colonial practices. A vivid illustration of the rules according to which the West wants us all to live is the fate of the commitments that were made in 2009 to provide developing countries with $100 billion annually to finance climate mitigation programs. If you compare that fate with the unkept promises and its unkept promises with the sums that the US, NATO and the EU has spent on supporting the racist regime in Kiev, according to reports $170 billion since February 2022, you'll understand what the enlightened West really thinks. It is high time for a reform of the existing global governance architecture. There should be no more artificially holding back of the redistribution of voting quotas in the IMF and the World Bank. The West must recognize the real economic and financial clout of the countries of the global South. It's important also to unblock the work of the WTA disputes body. There's an increasing need to expand the composition of the Security Council solely through eradicating underrepresentation in the composition from the global majority, so countries from Asia, Africa and Latin America. It's important that the new members of the Security Council, both permanent and non-permanent, are able to use their authority in their own regions as well, and in global organizations such as the Non-Aligned Movement, the G77 and the OIC. It is high time to look at fairer ways of making up the UN Secretariat. One criteria that's been in place for many years, or rather all the criteria that have been in place for many years, do not reflect the actual clout of states in global affairs and artificially ensure excessive dominance of citizens of NATO and EU countries. This disproportionate situation is made even worse by the system of permanent contracts, which links people to positions in host countries of headquarters of international organizations, the overwhelming majority of which are in the capitals that promote Western policies. A new type of UN reform is needed, where there are no leaders and followers or teachers and students, but when all questions are resolved based on consensus, reflecting of balance and of interest. For example, this is really borne by the BRICS, which has expanded its authority, in particular following the Johannesburg summit. And for also at the regional level, there's been a clear renaissance of the African Union, CELAC, the League of Arab States, the GCC and other structures in Eurasia. A harmonization of integration processes is underway as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Community, community and the CIS, the Chinese Belt and Road Project. Natural formations for a greater Eurasian partnership is underway as well. This is open to all associations and countries of our shared continent without exception. These positive trends, unfortunately, are being undermined by increasingly aggressive policies by the West and their attempts to maintain their dominance. It is in the common interest to avoid a fragmentation of the world into isolated trade blocs and macro regions. But if the US and its allies do not want to negotiate on making global processes free, or fair rather, and equal, the rest will have to draw their own conclusions and will have to make their own socio-economic and technological development not dependent on their neo-colonial instincts of their former neo-colonial powers. The main problem lies with the West because developing countries are prepared to negotiate. For example, in the G20, and we see clearly that the G20 must and should avoid politicization. It should be able to be engaged in methods to develop mutually acceptable ways of governing the world economy and finances. It's important to have dialogue, and we mustn't miss this opportunity. All these trends must fully be borne in mind by the UN Secretariat. Its statutory aim is to seek consent from all member states within the UN and not on the sidelines thereof. The UN was founded following the Second World War, and any attempts to revise this would undermine the foundations of the UN. As the representative of a country that made a significant contribution to defeating fascism and the Japanese militarism, I would like to draw attention to the egregious phenomenon of rehabilitating Nazis and collaborators in Europe, in particular in Ukraine and the Baltics. A particularly concerning fact is, for the first time last year, there was a GA resolution to combat glorification of Nazism, but for the first time this was voted against by Germany, Italy and Japan. This regrettable fact calls into question the true repentance of these states for the mass crimes carried out against humanity by them during World War II. It also runs counter to the conditions under which they were accepted into the UN as fully fledged members. We strongly urge you to pay particular attention to this metamorphose that runs counter to the position of the global majority and to the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, today humanity, as it has done in the past, is at the crossroads. It is entirely up to us how history will play out. It is in our shared interest to prevent a downward spiral into large-scale war and to prevent the final collapse of the mechanisms for international cooperation that were put in place by our predecessors. The SG put forward an initiative next year to hold a summit of the future. This can only be successful by having a fair balance of interests of all member states with the respect of the intergovernmental character of our organization. At our meeting on the 21st of September, the members of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter actively discussed the opportunities for achieving this. As Antonio Guterres said at the press conference on the eve of this session, and I quote, "If we want peace and prosperity based on equality and solidarity, then leaders have a particular responsibility to achieve compromise when designing our common future for our common good." End of quote. This is an excellent response to those who divide the world up into democracies and autocracies and dictate their neo-colonial rules to others. Thank you very much.